A 3 by 3 matrix is essentially a square matrix with 3 rows and 3 columns. Since they have 3 rows and 3 columns, we say that the dimension or the order of this matrix is 3 by 3. In our problem today, we have to find the product of two 3 by 3 matrices given in order. So this is my first matrix, and let's say this is my second matrix. And the way we're going to multiply these matrices, alright, before we find out the product or before we multiply them, we have to check whether they qualify for multiplication. Let's look at this. The dimension of this matrix is 3 by 3, and the dimension of this matrix is also 3 by 3. So we learned previously that in order for two matrices to qualify for multiplication, this number and this number have to be equal. This number represents the column number of the first matrix, so it has 3 columns, and this number represents the row numbers of the second matrix, and this has 3 rows. So these two numbers have to be same. Only then they will qualify for multiplication. In this case, they check, so we're going to be able to multiply them. Now, the way we're going to multiply them is we're going to select the first row. Let's say this is the first row I'm selecting. We're going to select the first row of the first matrix and the first column of the second matrix, and this first row of this matrix will hit the first column of the second matrix, and the entries will multiply with each other. Let me show you how that works. So over here, we're going to pick the first entry of the first row that I've selected, so that's 4. Let me write it over here, 4. And the first entry of the selected column is -3, so we have to multiply them, plus we have to add all of them up. So then we're going to select the second entry of the row we have selected from the first matrix, which is -2, and the second entry of the selected column is -1, so you can write that, plus the third entry of this selected row is -1, and the third entry of the selected column is 7. We have to multiply them together. Then finally we just add all of them up. Okay, now this selected row will hit this second column as well. So when we're working on the second column, then it will produce an element over here, which is the second element of the first row of the new matrix that we are trying to construct. Now the first element of this selected row will be multiplied with the first element of this newly selected column of this second matrix, so that's 2. We have to add all of them up eventually, so we're going to write plus sign, and then the second element of this selected row is -2, and the second element of this newly selected column is +3, and the third element of this selected row is -1, that will be multiplied with the third element of this newly selected column, which is 0. So we have to add all of them up. Each of them will be multiplied, and then we add all of them up, and that will produce the second entry of the first row of this new matrix, which is the resultant matrix of the multiplication of these two matrices, which is something we are going to construct in a few minutes. Now this same selected row will hit the third column, so this is my third column, and then the first entry will get multiplied with the first entry of this selected column, so we're going to get 4 multiplied with 6, plus then the second entry of this selected row, which is -2, this will get multiplied with this second entry of this selected column, -5, and the third entry of this selected row is -1, and the third entry of this selected column is +3. Okay, so what we did here we selected the first row of this first matrix, and this row will hit each of these columns separately, and that will produce the entries for the first row of the new matrix that we're going to construct. Now what we're going to do is we're going to select the second row of the first matrix. This time, this second row only hit each of these columns. So let's work on the first case. So this selected second row will hit this first column over here. So this is the one I've selected for now. So the first entry of this selected row, which is 0, that will get multiplied with the first entry of this selected column, which is -3. We're going to add them up. So then the second entry of this selected row, which is 5, will get multiplied with the second entry of this selected column, which is -1, plus then the third element of this selected row, which is -1, will get multiplied with the third entry of this selected column, which is 7. So we're adding all of them up after multiplication on each of these terms. Okay, now this same selected row, this second row, will hit the second column now on the second matrix. So this is what we're going to do. So this row will hit this column now. So we have selected them. Now we're going to multiply the first element of this selected row, which is 0. This will get multiplied with the first element of this newly selected column, which is 2. Add them up. Then the second entry of this selected row, 5, will get multiplied with the second entry of this newly selected column, which is 3, plus this third entry of this selected row, which is -1, will get multiplied with the third entry of this newly selected column, which is 0. So we're going to finally, after multiplication on each of the terms, we're going to add all of them up. Now we are still on the second row that we have selected, but this time this second row will hit the third column of this second matrix. So then what we're going to get is the first element of this selected row, which is 0, will get multiplied with the first element of this newly selected column this time, which is 6 over here, plus, because we're adding all of them up eventually. Now the second entry of this selected row will get multiplied with the second entry of this newly selected column, which is -5. And the third entry of this selected row, which is -1, will eventually get multiplied with the third entry of the selected column, which is 3 over here. So we're going to multiply each of these terms and then add all of them up. Now what we're going to do is we're going to work on the third row. Now we have selected the third row over here. This third row will hit the first column of this second matrix. So now let's see. The first element over here is -2. This will get multiplied with the first element of this selected column now, which is -3. Plus, we're adding all of them up. Now the second entry of this selected row, which is 0, this will get multiplied with the second entry of this selected column now, which is -1, plus the third entry of this selected row, which is -1. This will get multiplied with the third entry of this selected column, which is 7. We're done with the first column. Now the same row, same selected row, will hit the second column. So now let's do that. We select the second column now, and then what we're going to get is the first entry of this selected row, which is -2, and the first entry of this newly selected column, which is +2. They will get multiplied with each other, and then we're going to add. the next term, the second entry of this selected row, which is 0, and the second entry of this newly selected column is positive 3, plus the third entry of this selected row, which is negative 1. This will get multiplied with the third entry of this selected column, which is 0. Okay. Now finally, this selected row will hit this third column. So now what we're going to get is the first element of this will get multiplied with the first element of this. So let's do that. So the first element of this selected row is negative 2, will get multiplied with the first element of this selected column, which is positive 6, plus the second element of this selected row is 0. This will get multiplied with the second element of this selected column, which is negative 5, plus the third element of this selected row, which is negative 1. This will get multiplied with the third element of this selected column, which is 3. Now what we have done here is we have pretty much constructed the new matrix. The new matrix, which is the product of the given two matrices. So this is the matrix. This is the matrix we have produced. And this is the first entry of this new matrix. This is the first row. Now in this new matrix, this is the first row, second row, third row, and this is the first column, second column, and third column. Now let's go ahead and try to calculate each of these to find out the entries of the new matrix. Now let's calculate for the first entry. We have 4 times negative 3, that gives you negative 12, and this gives you positive 2, so negative 12 plus 2, that gives you negative 10, and this gives you minus 7, so negative 10 minus 7, that gives you negative 17, so I'm going to write negative 17 over here. Now let's look at the second entry of the first row. We are still in the first row, so this gives you 4 times 2 gives you 8, and this gives you negative 6, and this term goes away because it has 0. So then we're going to get 8 minus 6, that gives you 2. 2 for this entry. And the third entry in the first row, what we're going to get is 4 times 6, that gives you 24. This term gives you positive 10, and this gives you negative 3. So 24 plus 10, which is 34, and then we have minus 3, so 34 minus 3 is 31. So what we're going to get over here is 31. Okay, now we have this term. Now if we calculate this term goes away, and we have negative 5 from here and negative 7. So negative 5 minus 7, that gives you negative 12. And this term over here, this goes away, so we're left with only this term. So 5 times 3, that gives you 15. Okay, and then finally over here what we have is this term goes away, and then we have negative 5 times 5, which is 25. So we have negative 25, and then that gives you negative 28. So we're going to get negative 28 for this entry. Now over here, now if I multiply these two terms, what we're going to get is positive 6, and this term goes away because it has 0, and this is negative 7. So positive 6 minus 7, that gives you minus 1. So we're going to get minus 1 over here. And in this case, this gives you negative 4. This goes away because we're multiplying with 0 on both the cases. So we have negative 4. So this entry would be negative 4. And then over here, what we get is negative 2 times 6, negative 12. And this term goes away because it has 0. And this term is negative 3. So negative 12 minus 3, that gives you negative 15. So finally, we have constructed the resultant matrix. This is the product of the previous two matrices we started off with. Now quickly recap what we have done here. We selected each of the rows. So at first we select one row at a time. We select one row, and this selected row will hit each of these columns. That will produce each of the column entries on the first row. So because we selected the first row. Whenever you're selecting the second row, that means you're working on the second row of the resultant matrix. That will produce each of the entries of this second row. And how? You just select the second row, and then that second row will hit each of these columns and produce each of these column entries for the second row. When you select the third row, remember you're working on the third row of the resultant matrix, and the third row will hit each of these columns, and that will produce each of these entries on this third row. That's how it works. You just select a row, stick to that row, you don't change it until you finish hitting each of these columns of this second matrix. That is the key idea, and that's how we're going to multiply a 3x3 matrix. It's pretty simple. And finally, you do a little bit of calculation to clean things up, and you end up with a decent and nicer looking matrix which you expected to begin with. Now, the order or dimension of the matrix, let's check the order or dimension of this new matrix. Is this correct? Now, over here I can see the resultant matrix has 3 rows and 3 columns. So it's a 3x3 matrix. It means 3 row and 3 column. Now, previously, when we started off with the given 2 matrices, these two had to match in order for them to qualify for multiplication. But the order or dimension of the resultant matrix we can find from here is by taking these two numbers, this number and this number. So this would be the row of the resultant matrix, and this would be the column number of the resultant matrix, which means we could predict that the resultant matrix will have 3 rows and 3 columns, meaning the dimension or the order of the resultant matrix should be 3x3, and this is what we wind up with. We got a 3x3 matrix, and this is the product of these two matrices. We just found it. Thank you. See you in the next lecture.